Welcome to Infinity News. Hit subscribe, like, and drop a comment. You know, when big events happen, especially protests or clashes, trying to figure out what actually went down can be really tough.
Oh, absolutely. You get all these different reports, different voices, and sometimes they just don't line up at all, like looking through fractured glass.
Exactly, and that's really clear when we look back at the situation in Los Angeles around the anti-ICE protests in June 2025.
Yeah, those events generated a lot of headlines and, well, a lot of conflicting descriptions, too.
So that's what we're diving into today. We're looking at reporting that pulls together different statements and descriptions from that time. The mission here is really to unpack the different claims, especially about violence, as they were presented.
Right. We want to lay out the picture that emerges from these accounts, the different perspectives, the contradictions, even.
Just to help you, our listeners, see how the narrative itself was kind of contested.
So we know there were these major anti-ICE protests and a pretty significant response, right? Thousands of National Guard, even active duty Marines deployed by the Trump administration.
Yeah, big deployment. And amidst all that, you get these really starkly different takes on what was happening on the ground.
Okay, so where should we start? There's one central claim that really stands out.
Let's start there.
Yeah.
It involves Democratic California Representative Maxine Waters. She held a press conference June 10th, 2025. What did she say?
Well, the reporting highlights her making a very response statement. She basically asserted there was no violence happening in LA during those anti-ICE riots.
No violence. That's pretty definitive.
It is. And the context given is that she was criticizing that very deployment of troops we mentioned, arguing it wasn't needed because, well, things weren't violent.
Did she elaborate on that? Like, what specifics did she give?
Yeah, the report includes direct quotes. She apparently said, "Nobody was shot, nobody was killed, get it into your head." And she added, "Don't think that somehow because they called out the National Guard, there was violence. There was no violence. I was on the street, I know."
So she's claiming firsthand knowledge, saying she was out there.
She reportedly mentioned going through different areas downtown, Paramount, Compton, Inglewood, said she saw it herself.
And she even, gave advice to the press?
Sort of. Told reporters, don't just rely on what you're being told or the few incidents you saw. Basically, trust her broader view, maybe.
Okay, and the report mentioned she's 86, an 18-term congresswoman?
Yeah.
So a prominent voice making a very clear claim.
Exactly. A clear claim of no violence, based on personal observation, positioned against the government's response. But here's where it gets complicated.
Right, because the same reporting, immediately after laying out her no violence statement, goes on to describe, well, something quite different.
It really does. The language shifts dramatically. It starts talking about fiery anti-ICE riots and destructive chaos engulfing the city for days.
That phrasing alone, fiery riots, destructive chaos, that already seems completely at odds with no violence.
Completely. And then it gets into specifics about people getting hurt. It mentions injuries to journalists covering the events.
From rubber bullets, right?
Yes. A New York Post photographer reportedly shot in the head with one. An Australian TV reporter hit. A New York Times reporter, too.
Being hit by rubber bullets, especially in the head, that definitely suggests things were not calm or entirely non-violent.
You'd think so. And then there's the mention of a fatality. A man found dead near some downtown looting.
Though they weren't sure if it was directly connected to the riots yet at that point.
Correct. The report is careful to note investigators were still looking into it, but including it in the context of the riots obviously raises questions.
Okay, and didn't Rep. Waters specifically mention being in Compton and Paramount?
She did. And that's another point of tension, because the reporting then describes those exact areas as ground zero for some of the worst of the violence.
So direct contradiction there based on location. What did it say happened in Paramount?
In Paramount, it describes rioters throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails, and riot police responding with things like rubber bullets, smoke bombs, pepper spray.
Molotov cocktails. That's unambiguously violent activity.
Seems hard to frame otherwise. And then in Compton, it describes dozens of masked people ransacking a convenience store.
Ransacking, like looting.
Yeah, smashing windows, grabbing merchandise. It even mentions video evidence of people raiding the cash register, cutting cords on credit card machines to steal them. Photo captions describe people looting through broken glass doors.
So significant property destruction and theft.
Definitely. And the unrest wasn't just contained there. Remember the 101 freeway?
Oh yeah, the freeway shutdown. That was huge news.
Right. The report says over 2,000 protesters took it over, stopping traffic, and then later it was shut down again because people were apparently throwing things, bricks, scooters, projectiles, down onto police cars on the lower levels.
Throwing bricks and scooters onto police cars? Again, that sounds pretty dangerous. Not exactly peaceful protest.
Doesn't seem like it. And then there are the arrests. Nearly 60 reported arrests connected to the riots by the time this came out.
60 arrests. And the DOJ getting involved?
Yeah, promising to prosecute crimes against federal officers that suggests, serious confrontations were happening.
And visual evidence, too. You mentioned photo captions.
Describing things like rioters with Mexican flags in front of burning cars, images of cars being destroyed, stuff that's hard to ignore.
Okay, so let's just pause here. We have one prominent official, Rep. Waters, saying emphatically no violence.
Based on her stated observations.
Right. But then, in the same news report, we have detailed descriptions of reporter injuries from rubber bullets, a potential related death, Molotov cocktails, rocks thrown, police countermeasures, widespread looting, freeway takeovers with projectiles, dozens of arrests, burning cars.
It's a huge disconnect, all presented side by side.
And the report doesn't just leave it there, right? It brings in other politicians' views, too.
It does. It contextualizes Waters' statement, noting it kind of echoes other Democrats and some media outlets who are also framing the protests as peaceful.
Even despite, as the report itself mentions, injuries to law enforcement.
Apparently so. It quotes Senator Alex Padilla, also from California. He said, "The vast majority of protesters are peaceful."
Okay, the vast majority framing. But what about the ones who weren't?
Well, the report notes he called the rioters who torched cars and vandalized buildings appassionado, passionate.
Interesting choice of word, passionate. Acknowledging the acts, but maybe reframing the intent.
Perhaps. Then you have Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. He reportedly pointed the finger at President Trump for the violence.
Blaming Trump, how so?
Saying things like, a lot of these peaceful protests are being generated because the president is sowing chaos. So acknowledging violence happened, but shifting the cause.
Got it. But not everyone in the party agreed with those framings, according to this report.
No. It highlights Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania offering a really different take, a warning almost to his own party.
What did Fetterman say?
He's quoted saying, "I unapologetically stand for free speech, peaceful demonstrations, and immigration, but this is not that." He called it anarchy and true chaos.
Strong words. Anarchy and true chaos.
Very strong.
Yeah.
And he directly addressed the kind of actions we've been discussing. The quote included is, "My party loses the moral high ground when we refuse to condemn setting cars on fire, destroying buildings, and assaulting law enforcement."
So Fetterman, according to this, is explicitly calling out specific violent acts and saying they must be condemned. A direct contrast to the no violence claim within the same party presented in the same report.
Exactly. So you, the listener, are presented with this whole spectrum within just one news account. A flat denial of violence, detailed descriptions of violence, and then various political figures trying to frame or explain that violence in different ways or condemn it outright.
It really leaves you, the person trying to understand, in a difficult position, doesn't it? This report lays out the contradiction, but doesn't resolve it.
Not at all. It presents Rep. Waters saying no violence, then immediately details Molotov cocktails, looting, injuries, arrests. It forces you to grapple with that. How can both be presented as descriptions of the same reality in the same place?
It really underscores the challenge of getting information today. You read one thing, then you read the opposite, sometimes right next to each other.
This shows how understanding an event isn't always about finding the one true story. Sometimes it's about recognizing how dramatically different the stories themselves can be, even within a single telling.
It's not about us saying who was right or wrong here, but about looking at how the information itself was presented, these competing narratives packed together.
Precisely. It's about analyzing the information landscape you're navigating.
So maybe the thought to leave everyone with is this. When you encounter reporting on a major contentious event, and you find these kinds of stark contradictions like no violence versus detailed accounts of violence within the same breath, what does that signal?
Yeah, what does it tell you about the information itself, and how do you even begin to form your own understanding when faced with such fundamentally conflicting descriptions presented simultaneously?
Something to definitely think about. Thanks for tuning in to Infinity News. Hit subscribe, like, and comment.